Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mia Burke, and I work as program manager with Hanford Challenge. And if you aren't familiar with Hanford Challenge, we are a nonprofit based in Seattle that advocates for a safe and effective cleanup of the Hanford nuclear site. And the most important thing we do and what makes us unique is our support of workers on the front lines of cleanup. This is the 32nd webinar of our Nuclear Waste Scholar Series. And if you're new to the series, we started it to inspire action and involvement with Hanford Cleanup by inviting speakers to share groundbreaking scholarship, art, research, and experience working with nuclear waste. And if you aren't aware, we have almost all of the previous presentations uploaded to our YouTube channel, so be sure to check those out if you're curious. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Jeffrey Sanders. Jeffrey is a professor of history at Washington State University, where he teaches courses in modern U.S. and environmental history. He is the author of Raising Kids, Youth, Environment, in the Post-War American West, and he is the author of a chapter titled History Uncontained at the B-Reactor in the book Making the Unseen Visible, Science and the Contested Histories of Radiation Exposure. He is currently at work on a book-length project that examines the environmental and cultural history of strontium-90. Just as a heads up, if you can't stick around for the whole presentation, feel free to leave. We will be recording the presentation and we'll share a link of the recording with everyone that registered. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jeffrey. I'll pass it to you to talk about your work.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I thought I would start with this picture. These are my teeth. These are my wisdom teeth. And I'm going to commit a couple of sins. One is I'm going to read some, and then I have way too many slides, but we'll see how this goes. So in the spring of 2025, I stood in line at my crowded town post office, clutching a cardboard envelope, feeling a little like a crank. Inside were two of the four wisdom teeth a dentist wrenched from my teenage jaw back in the 1980s. I discovered them in a box of odds and ends that had sat in my basement for decades. Keys to missing padlocks, expired IDs, a personal reliquary. Now I was mailing the teeth to the lab of Mark Weisskopf, a professor of epidemiology at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health, 3,000 miles away. I had no idea what story my teeth might tell. This is Mark Weisskopf. He's the grandson of Victor Weisskopf, who was a physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project and also witnessed the Trinity detonation. He's a neuroscientist focusing on how early environments shape brain development. And his study is interested in the way that heavy metals, or lead, manganese, and zinc, may be linked to Alzheimer's. But he sort of lacks, or for a while at least, he lacked any really good evidence that could connect sort of the historic experience of where people lived with the kinds of maladies that they were experiencing. And this is a quote from Mark. He says, what was also going through my mind, this is when he was doing this kind of research, I'm screwed as an epidemiologist. With humans, I'm not going to, get someone in utero and follow them for 70 years, or at least I won't. Maybe my students will. And what Mark is looking at is teeth, like growing bone. Young people's teeth readily absorb calcium, lead, manganese, and even strontium-90, and potentially many other metals and isotopes that hang around in the environments where we spend our childhoods. In utero and to age 8 or 9, our bodies voraciously absorb available building blocks from the air, the water supply, soils, and especially from milk. Like coral reefs or clams, we accrete minerals and metals in these early years to form the skeletons that carry us through our lives. Some of these minerals and metals help in this growth process, and some do not. And this is an image of some coral that was taken from the South Pacific by a really important post-war ecologist named Eugene Odom, and this is in his collection in Georgia that I looked at. They're not radioactive, but he brought them back to look at the radioactive content of these materials. Deciduous teeth, also called milk teeth, are especially useful biomarkers, a way researchers gain knowledge about toxins in the environment. My wisdom teeth had to be yanked out, but the ones we shed as children are more plentiful. They hold the traces of past environments, like ancient tree rings that scientists use to understand the progression of climate change. Baby teeth hold clues to our personal environmental stories. They may also hold information about the causes of our current diseases of various kinds. However, a tooth in isolation, detached from a person or place, can only render so much information about causation. And unlike my wisdom teeth, we lose most of them along the way. But what if you could somehow gather up all those castaway teeth? What if the tooth fairy had held on to them all these years? And what if, like Santa Claus's list, the tooth fairy also kept track of your name, age, address, and other useful information along with your baby teeth? And what if the tooth fairy kept these teeth and records in stacks of old shoeboxes in their garage? This is exactly the lucky situation that confronted Dr. Weisskopf in the early 2000s. On one of his speaking tours during that time, a member of his audience suggested he contact a man named Joe Mangano, the executive director of the Radiation and Public Health Project. According to their website, Mangano's group is a nonprofit educational and scientific organization established by scientists and physicians dedicated to understanding the relationship between low-level nuclear radiation and public health. Mostly they studied strontium-90. Mangano is not the tooth fairy, as it turns out, but it turns out that he does have a massive cache of baby teeth in his Ocean City, New Jersey garage. And I think Joe is here today, and maybe he'll have something to add. And I apologize if I get any of this wrong, Joe. The boxes of teeth are a portion, just a small or a large portion of the 300,000 deciduous teeth left over from a massive mid-century citizen science effort called the St. Louis Baby Teeth Study, or survey. And this is one of the survey cards that the group in St. Louis sent out during the 1950s to collect teeth from little kids and information from families. St. Louis was one of many strontium-90 hotspots in the country and world in the 1950s, along with upstate New York, southern Utah, and even the Welsh Highlands. In these places, strontium-90 found its way into local ecosystems, cattle and sheep, and children's bones after each bomb test. The combined lack of government candor at the time and the sense of randomness about the threat of fallout from testing made strontium-90 a unique collective problem at the time. Unlike uneven distribution of toxics and environmental danger that often characterize environmental inequalities and racism, fallout had the potential to strike anyone, anywhere. It didn't appear to discriminate. It cut across populations. Concerned by unusually high levels of strontium-90 detected in the milk supply in Missouri in the late 1950s, a group of St. Louis area MDs and PhDs organized a large and first of its kind citizen-engaged science effort to challenge the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC's ongoing nuclear testing at the time. With a sophisticated direct mail marketing campaign, they convinced thousands of families in the Midwest and far beyond to surrender their children's teeth and vital data, which is hard to imagine now, I think, people doing this. Their findings led directly to the rationale for the 1963 Nuclear Test Ban Treaty that outlawed testing in atmosphere, sea, and outer space. So the story of everyday people, I think, is really interesting. The reaching out for answers, their vulnerable acts of trust, this idea of sending their children's teeth off to a group of Midwestern activist scientists. It has a compelling kind of innocence and generosity about it. And so these are some of the driving questions I have is, how did fears about strontium-90 drive citizen science and post-war environmentalism? Why was the St. Louis survey so effective? Why St. Louis? How did these teeth end up in a New Jersey garage? And how does the residue of strontium-90 continue to reverberate in unexpected ways? This is what I'm going to explore today. So these are some of the questions, but I also want to emphasize that these were acts of profound mistrust as well, and really a kind of a harbinger, I would say. These citizen scientists, with their hopes to prove danger where the Atomic Energy Commission denied it, indicated a challenge to expert authority at the height of the Cold War and long before the tumultuous 1960s, when we usually think of uh, sort of uprising um, and especially environmental activism of the kind of mass activism that emerges after the mid 1960s. Participation in the baby tooth study implied a growing frustration with the government's story and indicated an alternative source of evidence that young families and their children might be willing to trust. Their efforts suggested the hope for a democratized science that still lay outside the bounds of consensus in the 1950s, still in the realm of cranks. So these are my teeth that I sent away. And after I interviewed Weisskopf last year, had a great talk with him. He told me about what he's doing with these teeth. He agreed to test my teeth too. So here they are under a strip of tape on their way east. Perfect specimens, the platonic ideal of teeth, I think. Uh, the roots and enamel of a teenager in his prime. No coffee stains, no cracks, no fillings. But lead, strontium-90, something else. So what is strontium-90? I'd like to start there. And I know that this audience probably has lots of different expertise, and some people know all this already and some don't. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the basics of this. And I would also add that this is part of a larger project. So what I'm talking about today um, is going to be a chapter, but this is a story that is interested in the origin, diffusion, and consumption of this material from the 1930s to the present, but also its role in post-war science, public health, and ecology, both in the United States and the UK. The nuclear programs are very connected, and lots of trading of information happens between the countries over these issues, and a lot of secrecy as well. And then its role, strontium-90's role in provoking, I think, a post-war grassroots environmentalism that's familiar to us now. So what's in a name? First of all, when I was growing up, attended middle school, I saw the periodic table of elements on the wall and could not decipher it. And I don't think anybody helped me to decipher it. And so it's a real deficit. I wish now, late in life, now I'm really interested in this kind of material and science, and I wish I had paid attention. But what I think would have helped me is that each one of these little boxes, these letters and numbers, is a story. It has a history. And strontium itself, the naturally occurring form of strontium, has an interesting story, I think, where it comes from. It comes from this place, Strontian, which is in the north of Scotland. And I went to visit Strontian. And Strontian, if you look at this little hillside up here, right up here, that is this little knob on the top of the hill above Strontian. And it turns out that Strontian is from this combination of words, Shron on Tien, and it's the nose of the fairy hill is the way that it translates. So it kind of resonates with the story of tooth fairies, I think, to a certain extent, and a different kind of fairy, right? It's a not a Walt Disney fairy. This is a fairy that is a troublemaker, somebody that is more of possibly a chaos agent, even in these stories. This material, though, was isolated in the town of Strontian. So strontium comes from Strontian, and it comes from a mine that was mainly used to mine lead for the Napoleonic Wars. And somewhere around the early 19th century, a a scientist named Humphrey Davy traveled here and found this yellow material, strontium, and isolated it and named it after this place. So I think it's an interesting connection to the material history that we're talking about. But where does the radioactive version of strontium-90 come from? It comes from fission, and mainly born in the 1930s in probably most likely in Enrico Fermi's lab in Rome, and he didn't even know that he created it. So the first fission event happened. He wasn't even sure that he didn't know that he had created a fission event, and so there was probably a small release of strontium-90 at that time. And of course, it's it is the one of the most dangerous uh, radioisotopes that was produced out of the fission process. So a byproduct of fission. This is Chicago Pile 1, which is sort of um, the test case for the B reactor. It's a small version of the B reactor. The same um, uh, they tested it out in Chicago, famously in the squash courts there, and it produced on a larger scale more strontium-90 introduced into the environment, and then of course, at Hanford on an industrial scale to produce plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb first, and also the Trinity bomb as well. So, and a whole lot of it remains just 2 hours from where I live, because as part of the process of producing plutonium, there's just a huge amount of waste produced, strontium-90 and all kinds of other stuff that gets um, into the groundwater, also in tanks that are leaking right now that they're trying to clean up as we speak. And of course, a lot of it got into the groundwater and is moving still toward the Columbia River, and it's monitored constantly by the Washington Ecology Department and other authorities. But it's still very much with us, this material in terms of the various fission sites and the leftovers. And then, of course, Trinity, New Mexico, the first, the famous first test, and then Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Both of these are examples of the first large bombs, sending strontium-90 into the stratosphere, but also into the bodies of human beings. First in New Mexico, a lot of people in New Mexico contaminated, but also in Japan. But this is just the beginning. So fallout becomes an issue slowly. Some people understand the problems of strontium-90 releases, and the federal government, of course, really knows. But it's partly an issue of what they're willing to tell people and what risk and how they define that risk. And I just want to emphasize that this is a kind of Cold War scientific authority that is being established during this period, and that one of the key words here would be containment. It's a good way of thinking, about both foreign and domestic issues, that there's a kind of um, fiction that develops about containing these kinds of the explosions are contained because they're way off in a place in the Pacific someplace, or in the desert someplace. So it's sort of there's a fiction of containment at the very moment that so much more pollution and information really is being produced by each explosion. But there's also, of course, this is the period of the Second Red Scare. It's also an era of intense national security around these kinds of nuclear issues. And so it's really the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, that shapes the narrative of risk. And of course, what they say the risk is very different than what they actually know privately. And this is a key thing to understand, that the AEC, they knew that what they were doing had much more risk, especially for children, which I'll say more about in a moment. But they maintained this concept that it was reasonable to do this in order to keep up with the Soviets. So I want to emphasize this idea of spectacles of power, but also a fiction of control. And so both these things are happening. If you watch television during the 1950s, you're seeing a zillion explosions all the time. In fact, by 1963, there were over 100 bombs detonated, and each had code names like Buster Jangle and Castle Bravo and Operation Plum Bob. these different code names, and each of these blasts were, could be up to 100 million degrees, really hot, vaporizing everything in their path, including water, including animals, fish, kelp, all this kind of terrestrial material at the Nevada test site, bobcat fur, whatever, going up into vaporized and up into these mushroom clouds, along with the materials that are being released um, from fission, various kinds of nuclear or different kinds of chemicals that are moving out in, from the government's point of view, predictable way, predictable arcs over the country. And they continue to kind of fiction again that they were in control of this, and that it was not only in control, but it was controlled to certain kinds of spaces. Um, but also that perhaps it would go into the stratosphere and stay there. But of course, they were monitoring this all the time. And beginning in 1945, they were very clear about in the internal records. They had their own self studies. I mean, they studied what it was, what were some of the kinds of problems that strontium 90 might cause with if they continued to do testing. And this is well known information, but sort of behind the scenes, they're doing all of this study, but they're not telling the public about it. And this begins in like 1945 with various Operation Gabriel and Project Sunshine, these different internal studies of the effects of strontium 90 and the amount of strontium 90 that was being absorbed. And so again, strontium 90 sort of acts like calcium, and it moves into and follows the kinds of pathways that calcium would follow or take. And so once it comes down in the rain in places like Wales or in Missouri or upstate New York, it would, bind to clay particles and make its way into plants, and then those plants are eaten by cows. It's sort of one of those stories that you read when you were a kid about relationships between animals. The cow ate the grass, and the grass, that kind of ecological um, set of connections plays out with strontium 90, with the end point being the human body. And little kids have growing bones, and I've written about this also in my other raising kids, that growing bones are absorbing large quantities of calcium as you're growing, just like those milk teeth that I mentioned earlier. And so once it gets into bones, into teeth, into the body, it emits beta radiation that then affects cells and can cause leukemia, especially in children. And so you see during this period in places like Nevada and Utah, and I've looked at local newspapers in these places, and this is from Cedar City, but the newspapers in that region start to have these weird stories about cancer clusters. And so, something's going on, and people are trying to make this connection between what's happening down the road in Nevada and Mormon kids that are getting cancer that Mormon families have never seen before in their histories, and they keep good histories. Uh, so people are starting to wake up to this by the mid 1950s, and it's really 1954, the Castle Bravo disaster that blows a whole bunch of pollution off. Like I said, I mean, they think they have control over this, but it really blows way off course and envelops a Japanese fishing boat, a tuna boat, and a whole crew and the tuna that was in the hole. And they took it back to Japan, and this set off a movement in Japan among especially women who were organized around food and saying, what, we've got contamination here, and trying to bring the story forward about contamination and what really happened out there. So 1954 is a big turning point, and I've just looking at the kinds of records that I was looking at the National Archives. There's just like tons of letters coming in the 1950s from various people who have Geiger counters and who are starting to notice things in their local environments. They're starting to see things happening in their environments. And one of the places where this happens is Wales. Wales is a major hotspot during the 1950s, and this is from the Welsh Farm News in 1957. And this is, throughout the 50s, there are these kinds of stories about worries about strontium 90 affecting cows, but also sheep. lots of sheep farming going on in Wales, and so there's a lot of fear about how this is going to affect the marketplace in particular, but then ultimately children. And so you see people, and this is the story of Wales is very interesting because it also sort of gets caught up in the kind of nationalist movement in Wales during the same period. So there's sort of a pushback against England at the time around these issues. And so they start setting up their own labs in Wales. So people are becoming aware of where this material is going and how it might be affecting their livelihoods, but especially their children in particular. And like I said, this is during the uranium boom of the 1950s in the United States. So everybody's got a Geiger counter and they're going around and they're like, you know, after each explosion, if they learn about it, and like the Castle Bravo disaster, they start to measure it in their water, out back, up in the hills behind their house, and increasingly worry about this. One of the people that brings this really to the public in a significant way is Adlai Stevenson during the campaign in 1956, running against Eisenhower, and amplifies this story and warns about growing children are the principal potential sufferers from the radiostrontium content of milk. So there's a building sense among a lot of Americans that this is happening. So why St. Louis? So in the post-war period, there are a lot of Manhattan Project scientists at Washington University, and part of that is that the president of the university at that time was Arthur Compton, who basically invited all of his friends from the Manhattan Project to become professors there and do research. He created a cyclotron program, and so there are a lot of people there who understood what was going on, from the inside, and also probably felt guilty about what had happened, and what was happening, continuing to happen. And so they start creating a political organization around monitoring and understanding what was going on. And of course, St. Louis is also a hot spot during this time. This is one of the co-founders of the CNI, which is the I'm forgetting it at the moment. It's in the next slide, but um, there's just this sort of general sense that there's a lack of knowledge and a kind of eagerness among the public for clear answers. He says the time had come for scientists and laymen to work together, and the CNI idea was born. Now, CNI is the Committee for Nuclear Information, and they have some of their records at Washington University of these various scientists. And they published this newsletter called, a very influential newsletter called Nuclear Information, that basically, helped the public to understand. They had a huge circulation. I think something like 9,000 homes were receiving it. And they helped people understand the threat of not just strontium, but other kinds of chemicals. And of course, this is going to morph by the later 60s into a more general sort of clearinghouse for talking about toxics in the environment and that kind of environmentalism. But it gets started right around the 50s with these guys. So a lot has been written about the baby tooth survey, and I just want to acknowledge that. I think Michael Egan's book is really great in helping us understand how Barry Commoner and this group, the CNI, was pivotal in the environmental movement. And this is something I argue as well. And then Luke Ritter's work on sort of and this book called Left in the Midwest is really fantastic group of essays about this, about different kinds of progressive activism in St. Louis. It was a place of civil rights activism and also anti-nuclear activism, and then this group coming together to do this work. Now, my interest, though, is in the biography of one person, is really the star of the show for me. And I think her experience is pretty revealing and instructive. And much less has been written about this woman. Her name is Louise Rice, and here she is. She was an MD and sort of part of a generation of MDs. She was born in 1920, a generation of MDs, that women who were sort of breaking new ground. And she was also she was part of the organization of the CNI organizers, the founders, and her husband, Eric Rice, was also involved in this this effort as well. And she held most of the meetings at her house, and so she and most of the materials that came in, the mailings and the study itself, was really headquartered in her living room, essentially. And eventually, Commoner hires her to become the leader of the tooth survey, and there's a reason for this. And one of the main reasons that I want to emphasize is the context of polio. Um, it turns out that the Midwest in the 1950s was like the, you know, epicenter of the polio epidemic. It's also one of the first places where they really rolled out the vaccine, the Salk vaccine, by the mid 50s. And so, sort of this, the heartland is also the heartland of this effort to vaccinate, thousands of children. And this is what uh, Rice was involved with. She worked for the Public Health Agency in St. Louis, and this is the context that she comes out of to bring her expertise to the baby tooth study. So another context that's important here is the post-war um, uh, investment in public health that I want to really underline. That people like her, there were more jobs. They were hiring. They were also creating public health agencies after World War II, expanding the public health realm. And this coincides with the polio epidemic. And of course, the polio epidemic is an example of a great achievement. And from her point of view, and this is sort of the kicker, is that Rice herself grew up in the 20s and early 30s and suffered from polio herself as a child when she was 5 years old. And I've read her. This is her biography. She doesn't mention polio at all in the biography. It's really it's interesting. Um, I talked to her son. I had a nice interview with her son, and he explained to me sort of how she felt about polio, and that it was like this work with polio in St. Louis was the most important part of her life before she got to work on the baby tooth stuff, survey. So again, St. Louis is an epicenter of this kind of public health crisis. Barry Commoner is the real is definitely the sort of face of this part of the story, but she really was the organizer who organized this part of the story. And I want to sort of underline this as well, that I think the men in this story get a lot of play, and certainly Barry Commoner does. And but he also did come up with this concept of of using baby teeth as a way to monitor what was happening with the absorption of strontium 90, especially in children. So Rice is able to take these networks that she establishes in the 19 or the early 50s with the vaccine rollout. And she mobilizes some of the very same people. She says, I planned the forums, women volunteers from CNI worked on publicity and cataloging, Yvonne Logan supervised, Mrs. Leonard designed the button, I gave talks, and then there was TV. So they're just like incredible amounts of organizing around PR, essentially, and sophisticated marketing. This is the kind of marketing that they were doing, these cards that they sent out to little kids, very appealing to kids and families, sort of has a 1950s vibe. And you know, this is if you were a little kid and you wanted to give your teeth, you got something back in return. You got a button that you could wear to school, that you gave your tooth to science. That sort of reminds me of Alfred E. Newman, sort of that era of cartooning. But it's like sending a cereal box top off for a prize. And kids were really involved in this, and this is really crucial too. That families and children were engaged in this, in what Rice put together. And so they would get all these notes from kids, and then they had to reply to all these notes from kids. And this particular note is just a communication to the tooth fairy. Please save my tooth so I can send it to the for science, give it to science. And so again, this is the kind of information that each tooth arrived with in St. Louis, from all over the country, but a lot of it from St. Louis, where Rice was doing the majority of this kind of networking with all kinds of church groups, Rotary, etc. Um, and then it's an overwhelming success. And by the end of this, and she hardly used, I mean, she used a fraction of the teeth that came in, but they kept coming. And so, it came out to be like about 300,000 teeth that arrive and continue to come after they'd already finished the major parts of their study. And what Rice did is, very, very quickly put together a study and got published in Science in 1961. And she was able to show, sort of, without question, that there was elevated levels of strontium 90, which everybody understood by the late 50s that that meant that children were at risk because growing bones were absorbing this material. And so after she published this, she helps to set off a whole grassroots movement around the country. And one of the groups, Women Strike for Peace, is one group that monitored milk. So there are people doing tooth studies and doing independent tooth studies in different cities. And then there are people all over the country doing milk studies and sending notes to their dairy, about like raising consciousness about pollution in their food. Um, and and of course, children are a big part of this for obvious reasons. It was a way into the public sphere for a lot of women at that time to have political influence. Um, Obviously, but also just direct activism at places like the Nevada test site. And a lot of the folks that were doing this were also Women Strike for Peace, groups that are anti-nuclear, but also driven by this kind of citizen science, by data as much as possible. This is the article that she published in Science, if you're interested, strontium 90 absorption by deciduous teeth in 1961. And then when I was talking to her son, he remembered, that he picked up the phone at home this must have been around 62, I guess. And it was JFK calling. And he said, "This is John Kennedy. May I speak to your mother?" And, hands the phone to his mom. She goes upstairs, takes the call, and comes down and says, we did it. And so sort of a real sense of accomplishment. Rice's work directly makes its way, and sort of the whole conversation that's happening in the country makes its way into the test ban treaty language itself, the speech that Kennedy made at the signing. The number of children and grandchildren with cancer in their bones might seem statistically small, but this is not a natural health hazard. The loss of even one human life should be of concern to us all. Our children and grandchildren are not merely statistics toward which we can be indifferent. There he is, Johnson looking on, signing. And of course, after this, they kept testing underground. That's what happened next. Is a lot of this went underground. Rice says, "I continue to be moved." This was later in her life, reflecting on this experience. "I continue to be moved by knowledge that a group of organized people can effectively pressure the government if they come with data instead of rhetoric." So she was very aware of her role in all of this. So after the test ban, and I don't have time to talk in much depth about this, but I want to emphasize that a lot more work was done using these teeth for a while, and many more studies were published. And one group in particular, and this is Joe Mangano's group, the Radiation and Public Health Project, um, is the brainchild of Ernest Sternglass and Jay Gould, who are two activists who were interested in low-level radiation. So, sort of, if the releases are no longer happening on a kind of global scale into the stratosphere, now, well, let's focus on fission in nuclear power plants. And of course, during the period between the early 60s and 1980s, the number of power plants, but also the number of or the nuclear related efforts, of course, increased dramatically. And so the question is, what happens with this sort of low level radiation? Is that going to be a problem? And so this is the work that the Radiation and Public Health Project has been doing since 1985 to do that kind of study. But in general, the interest in the kind of the baby tooth survey kind of dissipates. And part of this is that Richard Nixon in 1970 cuts funding to the study that they had depended on. Um, so that's kind of interesting. It sort of reflects or echoes our time, I think, to a certain extent, sort of what's possible with state funded science in these kinds of um, situations. And then in about 2001, I think it's 2001, this is like 31 years after Rice has published this, they find out in this bunker on the edge of town, or like way out beyond the university in St. Louis. It's an old bunker that was a ammunition bunker that also held uranium during World War II. They found these boxes of teeth. Like this person from the biology department, it's just like an administrator. It's like, what is this? And the Student Life, which is the newspaper at Washington University, called it an eerie portal to the past. And I can imagine, like stumbling on this material would be a little, potentially disturbing. But these materials were important, and he understood the importance, started contacting some of the surviving scientists, and a lot of them had either died or moved on to other universities, but some of them were still there. And they in all the coverage during this time, none of it mentions Rice. It's mainly the different men that were still around, and especially Barry Commoner as sort of the mastermind. But of course, she was pivotal to the success of this and published the first article that was used to justify the test ban. Um, and but Barry Commoner says, yeah, send them to Joe Mangano, and that's how he ends up with these 85,000 teeth, maybe more. He can tell us, and sort of a jackpot, as he says in this quote. And what's important here is now we're 40 years out. Uh, at this point, now we're 70 years out. So the meaning of these teeth change over time, and how you can use these archives basically change, and the questions you can ask about them change. So it's an incredible thing to have this material still saved. And the Radiation and Public Health Project sort of keeps the flame alive during this period in the early aughts, before Mark Weisskopf, the guy I sent my teeth to, gets involved. And they started contacting participants in the original study. So they start doing this work of, like, calling people up and saying, 40 years ago you gave, or 30 years ago or 40 years ago you gave your teeth to science. What's going on with you now? And people describe different kinds of maladies, that, and the connection that they, sort of anecdotally at least, are connecting um, to strontium 90. And then Mark makes contact with Joe in the early in the aughts, and now Cambridge has access to these teeth. So now at Harvard, Mark Weisskopf is using these baby teeth to to study and try to understand the connection between basically lead poisoning early in life, or other kinds of heavy metals early in life, and other kinds of outcomes like diseases such as Alzheimer's. And his approach is historical. He's tracing these sort of contemporary conditions backwards in time to these places and these roots in places. And this is the kind of thing that's really, it's like it's like his science would be impossible. Basically, it would be very difficult for him to do and make the kinds of connections that he's making now without this data. And it's not just the teeth, it's the material, it's the cards that came with it, with the details of place, etc. And what Weisskopf says about his work is that he thinks engaging with people you actually study is central, and this is something that he kept emphasizing for me when I talked to him. And during the pandemic, he also began reaching out to some of the same people that the radiation folks reached out to, and would talk for hours with people about the study and about their memories about this experience. And then he's taking these teeth now, and he has way more resources than anybody had before. I mean, like Rice's group in their lab, they had to take teeth and like crush them all the way down to powder, and then they had to use different kinds of solution and different machines to figure out how much strontium 90 was in. Now Weisskopf is able to use laser ablation, so they're cutting teeth and can do all kinds of imaging, and it's just wild stuff. And And he's also using, psychology professors to figure out how to ask questions that get at, um, you know, people's experience and memory. It's a pretty phenomenal. I should have put uh, the the website on here, but if you want to look for it, just go Mark Weiskopf Tooth Fairy Study, and you'll find it. So one of the things that came up over and over again, though, when he was talking to people during the pandemic, especially, is that people were wondering about strontium 90, and he's not setting out to study strontium 90. He's interested in lead mainly, and other heavy metals. But increasingly, he's getting these questions about strontium 90 because it's in people's minds, right? And one of the things that he said to me is that they're starting to see some signals, he said, of people that lived near the Coldwater Creek nuclear power plant in Missouri. He's not sure yet, but he thinks that there might be elevated levels of low level strontium in people's teeth. And so this may be something he does in the future, if he's able. And so sort of interesting directions that these teeth could go in, I think. So what's in my teeth is the question. What's in my teeth? There they are. So this is like a slice, like a tree ring, and this red part of this, this on this far this part, this I couldn't read this. He just told me, "Don't worry about it. It's fine. You're at the same level as most of these people that we're looking at." But I'm pretty freaked out about this, I have to say. And I put this into Chat GPT, of course, and had Chat GPT read my data. And what they found, or what it's telling me, is that these are high levels of, or not high, but they're spikes between the ages of 1 and 3, it looks like. And that's when I lived about 2 blocks from the I-5 freeway in Seattle growing up for 3 years. And I lived in an ancient house with my parents. And now I'm thinking, my God, I'm like crawling around on the floor eating, lead paint chips probably. And so during this one period, you can see this very clear elevation in the amount of lead that's in that's in my tooth. And I still think they look beautiful, but and I love these images. But too late to be strontium 90. I was born in 1968, so it's too late to have experienced or absorbed strontium 90 from testing. But that doesn't mean that I might have had something, but that's what he found. So I wanted to just end on a couple of thoughts. I mean, first of all, data and data centers that I use ChatGPT to examine the findings, and we live in a very different data era. I'm thinking, would I ever send my teeth away to a lab now? Not even, I don't know that I would. And now Mark has my data and ChatGPT has my data. And I'm just thinking about sort of how it might affect my, um, insurance premiums in the future. But the other thing I wanted to mention is just when I was lucky enough to go to the annual meeting of the radiation of Joe's group, and one of the things that they were discussing there is the uptick in, or the potential sort of, uptick in the amount of nuclear plants that people are trying to bring back online now. And so, like, 3 Mile Island is coming back online because of Microsoft, because they need more energy for data centers. So there's this other aspect, which is sort of a return of fission, essentially, that we're going to see probably more waste. And a lot of that waste is going to end up in, a lot of it's going to end up at Hanford, actually, and places like that in centralized locations, in my case, 2 hours from me. And it's sort of interesting to think how maybe we still really need these analog fossils to think about our next nuclear age, and how it plays out and how to resist it if need be. So some of the broad conclusions, I think these are examples of activism in response to the threat of strontium 90 that was part of a broader shift in American ideas about global ecology, linking these far-flung places that in a leafy suburb of St. Louis is connected to the Nevada test site, to the Pacific, to Kazakhstan, to various test sites around the world. This kind of understanding. And I'd say that unlike pre-World War II environmentalism, these kinds of ideas focused much more on the intersection of bodies and toxins and local places and local knowledge. And I think that this is that strontium 90 is part of this shift, and the work that people in St. Louis did is part of that shift. And especially, I think strontium 90 helped to drive post-war grassroots environmental activism and an effort to democratize science, which we can talk about could be a double-edged sword in some ways, but at least it lays the groundwork for a kind of more democratized conversation about it. So here's Reese. She died of Alzheimer's in 2011. And I'm thinking that maybe Mark's team will be able to figure out the link between environmental toxins and this disease that she died from. But I think she is uh, has a powerful public health legacy, and ultimately she was involved with, or and may be helpful in solving or addressing, polio, radiation-related childhood leukemias, and Alzheimer's, because of the work that she did. So I just want to end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. We've had a lot of comments come through in the chat, and please, if you all have any questions or additional comments, please put those in either the chat or the Q&A feature at the bottom, and I can read those off. We can start the Q&A. I do want to share. So Mark Weiskopf, I think, is listening in now,
Oh no.
and wrote to say that they also just used the childhood addresses, and found that those kids who lived closer to Coldwater Creek had more cancer many years later. So I'm gonna share this message with everyone just so you can get the link to the journal article that he shared. But it sounds like they did do that study,
Right.
and was conclusive. And there is an initial question specifically about your tooth results. It's the question is your tooth in the early years at 100 parts per million lead?
I have trouble reading it. So I mean, the I don't have the readout available. So I'm not sure what the amount is.
Okay, I think they're trying to read it from that
Yeah.
squiggly
Yeah.
line and
Yeah. I It's confusing to me too.
yeah. Let's see. Has there been a comparison done of various biomonitoring studies? So teeth, urinalysis, blood, hair. I helped coordinate an NYS Department of Health urine biomonitoring program, which found depleted uranium in the urine of former workers and residents at an Albany uranium munitions factory 31 years after exposure.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that question either. That's a little beyond my historical approach. I haven't done comparisons between teeth and other and hair and urine, but that's interesting. And I'm sure,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, we have an answer from Mark. So
great.
Jeff, your levels were at about 1 parts per million, which was right about the average of the baby tooth folks, and that's for lead. Those average levels, though, are far higher than what we see in current day children. So
Yeah.
that's helpful. Thank you, Mark, for reading those results.
And
Um,
that is what he told me in the email. It's just what that means for me, I don't know. We'll see.
mhm. Um, So it seems then that ongoing mapping of cancer clusters becomes especially important since those clusters might further encourage those born in the 1950s to get their teeth tested. Given sophisticated testing methods, can you test teeth while they're still in someone's mouth?
Oh boy, I'm sure you could, but I have no idea how that works and who's gonna I mean, if it wouldn't be this methodology, right, of slicing into someone's tooth unless they volunteered it. But I think the point there is really important that back to Rice's statement, that instead of rhetoric, evidence, data, that for so many of these issues, having hard data really benefited what the kind of political momentum that people could create, and also engaging with communities, which you'd think, well, that would be much easier now, but it takes money and it takes time, and um, but I think the more we engage with, especially the kind of what I would say is citizen science. I mean, that's really what, even if you're a little kid putting your, volunteering your tooth to science, that's what you're doing. You're participating in a citizen science activity. That's a way of gathering people in, informing them, and making them become political at the same time. Um, so that kind of participation is crucial, and that to me, that's the big takeaway from all this. But again, when you compare, it takes money. If federal funding, in the case of Washington University, I think that Joe's group had less money to do that kind of thing. Um, the timing was also different, but Mark has probably more expertise and money at his disposal, at least for now. But this is a question I think that's, like how science is funded, who's doing the science, where it's being done, who has the authority. These are all really interesting questions, and are obviously super contested right now. Um, yeah,
Yeah, and I think what you brought up in the talk, and an important point is that Rice had from the polio work that she did, had this like had the groundwork done and the trust built with the community to then apply that to this and have it be a success, the baby tooth survey. And
yeah,
how important it is to recognize that work,
yeah, I
building
agree.
those relationships.
And I mean, part of that is that, and I think we some people like to, sort of, I don't know, mythologize the 1950s, right? Obviously, no. And or the 40s, but these were, I think, in a place like St. Louis, these are all institutions that were created either during the war or right after the war. So these were it's not like these were timeless organizations that she tapped into. People were joining things, joining organizations, become participating in their democracy in other ways. And so, it's not like we've just lost something. It's we've and I would include myself in this. There are just fewer of these. It's sort of like that book Bowling Alone, that sociology book about, people, bowling leagues have dropped off, whether you believe that critique or not. Just there are fewer joiners, and St. Louis had a critical mass of joiners, who are doing these things and able to tap into the sort of the trust among groups of people. And these were not all, leftists. A lot of them were, but they were able to make a wider appeal, I think,
Mhm.
around these issues.
Yeah. Okay. There have been a lot of. Are you aware if there have been any baby teeth studies done near sites of nuclear reactors?
I believe so. I mean, I think this is what a lot of what Joe's organization has done is study, and low level radiation near various sites in New York, especially. And you know, some of those studies, I mean, I think a lot of them are contested by especially people in the industry, and there are, probably still a kind of record to build. But it sounds like what Mark is doing, Weisskopf is doing, is making that case, and but doing it with more sophisticated methods, I'd say.
Yeah, incredible ways to gather the data.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I'm just trying to read through all these comments to see if there's a question. How about recruiting dentists to gather tooth drilling materials, the tooth itself, fillings, glues used in dental bridges, dusts from dentist office air filters in rare cases when they are used for analysis? I don't know if this has been done, but it's a
I
good
have no idea.
suggestion.
I would say this though, that a couple of things come out of this, out of St. Louis as well, is that the dental school was critically involved in all of this.
Mhm.
So they had all the, they had the labs there in the dental school. They had a lot of people from the dental school. In fact, some pioneering um, women in dentistry during that period were part of this effort. And I always go back sort of the structural issues here. There's huge amounts of money being invested in dental health in during World War II and after. So fluoride and all the different ways that public health and dental health were coming together during that period that made it possible to gather this kind of information and study it. So it's a really good question, but I don't know about. That's an interesting idea. Air filters and
Yeah.
my teeth. And yeah,
Could you say more if you know about what happens when testing starts to go underground? What is the fallout equivalent of underground testing? And what happens to the metabolic trophic pyramids of strontium after 1961?
oh boy, yeah. I can't answer that, but I can say that I know that there have been lots of examples of underground testing venting, um, you know, radioactive pollution out from underground. I mean, and this happened right away after the test ban in the 60s. So yeah, um, lots of examples of that, even when it's gone underground. And yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, let's see. There's a question about have they done any studies at Hanford, particularly of those young people born in the 40s? And I'm not sure. Are you sure? Have you heard any tooth studies done for Hanford children?
I haven't, not two studies, and
Yeah.
I mean, I think that a lot of the health physics stuff there is mainly for workers, but I'm
Yeah.
sure families. I mean, I don't know, but I know that they monitored families during production and in the 50s. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I don't know about studies there. These are
Yeah.
all great questions, and yeah, it's a
Yeah,
lot.
we also have a lot of experts on
Yeah,
in terms of Mangano and Mark and it's so
intimidating.
cool.
Yeah,
The chat is there's lots of comments in the chats. It sounds like that Joe Mangano has authored numerous articles regarding baby tooth levels adjacent to nuclear reactors. Um, let's see, how might we use this data to prevent more nuclear power plants today? Is a new question that came in.
yeah. I mean, I think that it has to be the same way of mobilizing. I mean, this is something when I went to um, the radiation public health annual meeting. I was struck by, I was invited by Joe to sort of sit in, and I was struck by the the sense that the message isn't getting out, and the
Mhm.
difficulty of getting that message out, especially to younger people. And that, sort of, there's something about nuclear, I think, for some people in some age groups, possibly, that it doesn't strike them. It you know, doesn't seem like a problem.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure, and they didn't seem sure about how to do that. What do you make TikToks, or how do you discuss, how do you get the message out to such a different kind of public relations and or news environment. How you do that, I'm not sure, but I think that using this kind of evidence is critical.
Mhm.